and you're watching That Spooky Lifestyle, where we bring the ooky, the spooky, the creepy, and the crawly into our everyday lives. This is my second video in my 4-part Amityville series. Today we're going to be talking about the horrific paranormal activity that the Lutz family experienced when they moved into the Amityville property. But before we jump in, let's take a quick look at what we talked about in part 1. Here we are. On November 13th, 1974 at 6 p.m., Ronnie Jr. came bursting into the local bar, screaming that someone had killed his parents. The bar was filled with Ronnie's friends, and this startled them quite a bit. Obviously, they weren't prepared to hear that kind of thing. Hellish. I'll link it above in case you want to check it out. I do recommend watching that before watching this video, just to give it some context, and I might be giving away some spoilers to that video in this one. But if you're ready to get started, let's descend into the supernatural events that occurred at 112 Ocean Avenue in 1975. The Lutz family moved into the roomy 4-floor Amityville house on December 18th, 1975, and survived there for 28 days until they hastily fled the property at 7 a.m. on January 14th, 1976. The Lutz family consisted of 5 family members total. There was George Lutz, who was the dad, then there was Kathy Lutz, the mom, and then they had 3 young children. Missy was their youngest and only daughter at around 5 years old, and then they had 2 older boys, Danny and Chris, who were around the ages of 7 and 8. They also had a pet dog named Harry. So it's said that the Lutz family had heard of the DeFeo murders that happened at this house a year prior, but they didn't know any of the details or anything. They just knew that it had occurred there. However, because the murders took place in this house, that made the property a lot more affordable than it normally should have been. For that large of a house, it was quite cheap. They had looked at a few houses prior to the Amityville location, but once they found it, they fell in love and knew that this was going to be the house for them, and they didn't really think too much about it. They even went as far as purchasing some of the old furniture that was left in the DeFeo house after the murders, which is like a bit much. They purchased the dining room table as well as a couple of bedroom TV sort of sets for the kids. I'm trying not to judge, because if you don't have the money or you didn't want to, you know, like if there was a financial situation where it just made sense to use that, I mean, maybe that's what they were thinking. But for me personally, there is no way. I would sleep on the floor before that. So when the Lutz family first moved in, obviously there was a lot to do around the house with like unpacking boxes, organizing, finding places for everything. Anyone who's ever had to move knows that it is a whole process, especially when multiple people are involved and you're not just moving yourself. Keep in mind the date too. It was already December 18th, and the Lutz family did like celebrate Christmas, so they also were trying to organize, you know, all the gifts and what they were doing and get all of that together and ready for December 25th. Moving at Christmas time would just be awful. Like I couldn't even imagine. During this time, obviously, everyone in the family was quite busy. Like the kids, you know, they had a new place, a new space to sort of check out and get, you know, their rooms organized and schooling. And Kathy and George were busy with, again, organizing the house as well as Christmas. So the family didn't really notice at this time, but they did start to see a slow personality shift for everyone in the family. family. So they moved in December 18th, and over the next few days there would just be subtle things here and there, looking back on things that they thought were odd but not odd enough to make a big deal out of. Some examples, like Danny and Chris, the two boys, started fighting with each other a lot more and would talk back to their parents. Strange behavior for them and their family dynamic, like that's not how their personalities normally were. George and Kathy chalked that up to, you know, moving to a new place. They thought it was odd and that the kids were being bratty, but nothing like, oh, they're completely changing who they are kind of thing. Everyone in the household except for Missy, who was the youngest, did become more aggressive during this time, not like physical or fighting like anything we talked about in part 1, but more just snapping at each other and getting irritated a lot easier. The biggest personality change that the Lutz family would notice or experience was that of George Lutz, the dad, and this is often what the horror movies of Amityville are based off of, is George Lutz's experience in the Amityville home. On top of being just more agitated in general, George stopped taking care of himself. He stopped shaving and showering as often, sort of becoming this kind of scruffy lumberjack looking guy, and not in a sexy sort of way, in a like, you dude take a shower sort of way. He was also very unmotivated for the first few days that they were in the house, avoiding work, saying that Kathy was sick or needed help around the house. Just really weird behavior that just kind of kept him stuck in the house or stuck at the house. During this time, George Lutz also recalled being very chilled. He just couldn't shake this chilled, cold feeling in his bones. No matter how often he sat by the fireplace or how intense he made the fire, he just couldn't get warm. This led to George Lutz sitting just in front of the fireplace most days, trying to get warm, stoking it. It was just really weird behavior to be off by himself, kind of ignoring his family, doing his own thing. Kathy would often walk in on him being just at the fireplace, staring into the fire, not doing anything. And like I said, he did stop going to work for a little bit, but he did own his own company. Like, he was the CEO, the boss, so he could kind of do whatever he wanted there. He also felt this weird pull to constantly go check the boathouse and be in the backyard of the house. He would just be like sitting, doing something, and get this feeling like, oh, I should check the boathouse. He could never really say why he wanted to go check the boathouse. There was never actually a reason. It also didn't help the situation that George Lutz would constantly wake up at 3:15 a.m. every night. And it was usually because of something odd going on in the house that he couldn't really explain. And sometimes he would just wake up in the middle of the night and feel like he had to check the boathouse. Like, it was just really random, odd reasoning. Sometimes he would wake up and it would be so cold in the house, and when he'd go and check, some of the windows were open, even though when everyone went to bed, everything was closed, shut tight. Again, it's December, it's starting to get chilly out. At this point, there isn't any snow on the ground yet, but it is still very brisk, cold winter air. There was one incident when George woke up at 3:15 a.m. and heard this weird knocking noise, and then when he went to go check out who was knocking on their front door had actually been broken wide open, and it looked like it was coming off of its hinges, but like someone had pulled it really hard from the inside trying to get out, if that makes sense, not someone from the outside kicking it in. So that would be a really scary thing to come down to. Just in general, if like a person walked by that was, you know, less than friendly, they could just walk into your house while you're sleeping. That's scary. Weird activity like that would happen to George during the night. Kathy Lutz also experienced some personality shifts during this time. She just found herself being very unmotivated, especially with everything to do around the house. Her and George really just became almost like like lethargic at this point. Like they were just really unmotivated, not doing much. And both of them kept making like weird excuses not to leave the house. They kept like justifying it as, oh, there's so much to do around here, we're still not done, yada yada yada. But they still had to get quite a few Christmas gifts that they wanted to kind of finish up their Christmas shopping, and they never ended up doing this. And Kathy actually recalls feeling a bit guilty when Christmas came around because she kept putting it off, and then all of a sudden it was Christmas and she didn't have all the gifts that she like had planned to get that year. If you're moving right before Christmas, I think it would be understood that that Christmas would be different than other years just because of how much needs to get done and things like that, how much you're already spending to move, etc. Something that I found odd too is even their dog Harry became quite lazy and sleepy, and he used to be quite playful and active, and every time George went to check on him when he was checking the boathouse, Harry would be sleeping and he didn't eat much food at this time. Another weird behavior that the entire family shared was they all started sleeping on their stomachs, which if you watched part 1 you might get a hint as to why that would be. It was just something that like George and Kathy started noticing that they hadn't really noticed before. Following these odd personality shifts, there were also weird events that would happen around the house, and again, it always starts out with small odd things here and there, and then they start to escalate. So these events happen throughout different rooms in the house, but they were definitely centralized in Kathy's sewing room, which was on the 2nd floor, Missy's bedroom, which was on the 2nd floor, the living room, and then in the basement in their cellar there was some odd activity there as well. I should specify, in this cellar they did find this kind of hidden room under the stairs, and like specifically that hidden room is where they had a lot of paranormal activity. Alright, so these events that occurred are just odd. Like one day Kathy went into the bathroom and found that all the toilets in their house were black, almost like someone had taken a paintbrush and just painted the bowl black. It wasn't like it was the water or something in the water. It was like someone had actually came in and painted the porcelain. So at first Kathy thought it was the kids, and so got after them, yelling at them, and they're like, we didn't do it. So that's when she started cleaning the toilets, and she realized like they wouldn't have been able to. They're all so young, like where would they have, how would they have even been able to do this? She couldn't even really rationalize how that happened, and she never really figured out what it was. She did eventually get the black off of the toilets. Another incident occurred when there was this really foul smell in the house. On this day, George was away at work and it was just Kathy and the kids in the house. And when Kathy went upstairs to their master bedroom, which seemed to be where the smell was coming from, she opened their closet and the cross that they had hung in there was upside down. On another day, George went into Kathy's sewing room and saw that one of the windows was just completely covered in black flies, which was weird at this time because it was December. It wasn't like snowing, freezing, how it gets in some places, but it was chilly enough that flies shouldn't be alive or around. So this brings us to Christmas Day, and Christmas is when Kathy learns about Missy's new friend Jody. Jody was this imaginary pig that Missy would talk to, and at this point Kathy didn't think anything of it because like Missy's 5 years old, kids make up imaginary friends all the time. So Kathy really did think like, oh, this is just another one of her friends, like that's nice. The days following Christmas, they had a few more visitors to their house because again, at this point their house was a bit more put together and you know, they had things where they needed them. It was just easier at this point to have guests over than it was previously. At one point, they had a nun who was a friend of the family come over, and this nun just wouldn't even walk into certain rooms in the house. Like she wouldn't go into Missy's bedroom and she wouldn't go into the sewing room because when she first showed up, Kathy and George gave her like a tour of their home, right? And like she just refused to go into those rooms, and then she basically left immediately after the tour was done. There was also an incident with Kathy's brother Jimmy and his new wife Carrie, they came and actually stayed overnight at the Amityville house, and Carrie woke up screaming in the middle of the night because she saw a little boy in her room that wasn't Danny or Chris. And Carrie told everyone that this little boy was like asking for help from her. After this little boy incident, Kathy and George went to their closet, grabbed their crucifix, and blessed the house themselves. They finished their blessing in the living room downstairs, and it said once they finished it, they heard a rumble of voices coming from a bunch of different places that basically all shouted at them, "Will you stop?" There was another time when one of the neighbor's kids came over to play, and he like refused to go in the house. He wanted to just stay outside and play on the porch. Again, this is like late December at this point, and so that was also very odd that he wanted to just stay and play outside on the chilly porch rather than coming inside. And he only ever came over once. After this kind of play session, they never saw him again. So naturally, the longer the Lutz family stayed at this Amityville property, the more intense the paranormal activity became. So the Lutz family had this lion statue in the living room downstairs, or sorry, on the main floor. And every time Kathy passed the living room, she said it felt like this statue was watching her, following her. And so she moved this statue into her sewing room upstairs. Because so much activity had gone up in there, she was kind of avoiding that sewing room, and she just put the statue in there, forget about it. As she went back downstairs, she glanced into the living room, and the statue was back in the living room, and the lion was like baring its teeth at her, kind of like shifting how the statue initially looked. One evening after the kids had gone to bed, Kathy and George were sitting in the living room on the main floor in front of the fire, just enjoying time together, and this white cloaked figure appeared to like come out of the fire and try and grab them. I know these sound kind of like really intense experiences, and it's like, well, why didn't they just leave? Why even stay? A lot of it had to do with how much money they had put into the house. Although it was really affordable compared to what it should have been, they still spent quite a bit of money to be there, so financially they felt like they were stuck. And then as well, a lot of this activity happened during the night, and so you can kind of like rationalize it away in the morning. Throughout these sprinkled paranormal activities, Kathy and George would see these small beady red eyes like appear in weird places, like through the window on the in the second story, and it would look like someone was peering in at them or something was peering in at them, and they really couldn't explain it, but it gave them a very uneasy feeling. There was one incident where George started smelling intense like human feces, and he checked the whole house and there was no reason for that to be happening, so he tried to follow the smell, and that's when he found the secret hidden room underneath the stairs. And this room was extremely creepy even on its own. It was all red, and it was like hidden behind a closet downstairs. You had to actually like pry open a board to see it, and the walls were red, the ceiling was red, and the floor was red. It was just an all red, creepy looking room. So George looked into the room, but it is quite small, and there wasn't anything that he could see that would be causing this smell. But he does recall that later he had a nightmare about this little room of hooded figures like standing in this room. But apart from that, nothing is really explained about this little room at all. So Kathy was having most of her paranormal experiences in their kitchen. She would start to smell this kind of perfumey, cheap floral smell, and then she'd start to feel like hands on her. Sometimes it would be a really tight hug, sometimes it would be someone like grabbing her shoulders or her hand. It started off being almost kind of comforting, but then, you know, this force would squeeze and squeeze and squeeze, and sometimes it would even cause Kathy to pass out. So by the time early January hit, both Kathy and George were well aware that something supernatural and weird was going on in the house. They, at this point, were talking to each other about it when the initial events started happening. They both would rationalize it away and not really bring it up to each other, but at this point, enough weird stuff had happened to them individually as well as together that they were openly like, what are we gonna do? As the events started to intensify, they shifted more from like affecting things around Kathy and George to physically attacking them. Like, George recalls one incident where he woke up in the middle of the night and heard marching band noises so loud that he really thought someone was in the house, so he got out of bed and ran downstairs, and the minute his foot hit the landing on the main flooring, the entire house went silent. So it was like really loud, really loud, really loud. He got all the way downstairs and then his foot touches the floor and then it's stillness. That would be so terrifying. He said that as he was kind of standing there looking around like, what the hell's going on? He felt a breath kind of go by him up the stairs. And so that's when he was like, I need to go back to Kathy to make sure she's okay. Then he bolts back up the stairs, and when he gets into the master bedroom, he finds Kathy levitating there. So he pulls her back down to the bed, and when she wakes up, she doesn't remember anything. Now, to me personally, I think the marching band and the noise and the idea that something is trying to like distract you is way creepier than the levitation itself. I don't know why, but it just, to me, that's the creepy part to it. So another physical attack happened when Kathy woke up in the middle of the night. George was already awake at this point. He doesn't really sleep much. He turned over to her and she looked like this withered old hag. And so he was like, ugh, like startled and scared, which scared Kathy. She ran to the washroom and looking at her face, she looked like herself, but she had these 3 deep gashes on her face, almost like something had scratched her. So then she was freaking out about that. But after a while, that did fade and her face went back to normal. There were a few incidents like that as well, where there would be a physical attack and then a few hours later it would fade away, and that would kind of mess with you mentally. Like, did that really happen? Was I imagining it? Did I just blow it out of proportion? I think there would be a bit of, you know, self-doubt going on there with that happening as well. Because in another instance, Kathy woke up with these boils all over her body, like her torso, and they were like hot to touch and they hurt. But again, after a few hours, they just sort of went away. So weird stuff like that was going on. At one point, Kathy and George would find this green ooze coming out of the doorways and around like the door handles, seemingly to almost be like bleeding from the door itself. There wasn't any other external source of the ooze that they could find, and they said it had a very like jello-like substance. Like, George actually thought it was jello at the start and thought the kids might have been messing around with something, but the more he, you know, looked into it and couldn't find anything, like it wasn't jello, it was just some sort of weird creepy ooze that was coming out of their door. Like, it seemed to come out of like the keyhole in their doors and stuff. Super creepy. Again, I know what you're thinking. Well, why didn't they just leave then? From my research, it looks like in the beginning, mid to late December, they were still trying to rationalize it. The incidents were kind of isolated and not a lot happened with both people in the room, and so Kathy wouldn't bring it up to George, George wouldn't bring it up to Kathy, and they were just kind of rationalizing it as like a new place, new house. Then as it shifted, Kathy did constantly asked to leave the house, but George would always make up reasons why they couldn't. Not really making them up, but gave good reasons why they couldn't. Like, the kids had to go to school and he had to go to work, like they still had bills to pay, and they had a lot invested in this house. And so I think Kathy was more of the, I'm sick of being here, let's go to my parents' place, and George was like, we've got so much invested in this house, like we can't just leave it. Like, this is everything we own and all we have. But then as the attacks became like worse and worse, and like Kathy and George were starting to physically get attacked, George and Kathy were starting to get worried that the kids would start being attacked by whatever was in the house. So I think that slowly kind of is the trail of events of why they didn't leave. So at the point where, you know, Kathy's levitating, there's like boils, they're both getting physically attacked, they're both talking to each other at this point in early January. They did try to leave a couple times on the days leading up to the final day when they actually left, and weird things would happen. Like one night they were like, yeah, we're gonna leave tomorrow morning, and then this crazy storm came in, it blew open all their windows, and there was water everywhere, and you know, like water damaged things, so they didn't want to just up and leave the next morning then, because everything in that house would be wrecked and people could easily come in and loot all their items, because now some of the windows were broken and like they had to wait for repairmen to come to get fixed. And again, it's like easy to be on the outside and be like, oh, I would just be out of there, but your rational brain kicks in and you're like, well, again, this is all of our stuff. Like, if we don't save this bed, like we no longer have a bed and we don't have the funds to just rebuy everything. So they did have to stay and like fix up the house and reclose all the windows, like get repairmen to come, mop up all the water, you know, fix as much as they could before they could leave. And then they tried to leave again another night after this, and they got everyone outside into the van, and then their vehicle wouldn't start. Again, this like mysterious storm came in, and then everyone had to get out of the car and go back into the house. It's like early January and it's really cold out, so rain plus snow plus freezing temperatures, like you don't just want to be like walking over to your mother's place or something, because that's where they were going. They were trying to go to Kathy's mom's house, but it was still like a drive away, like you couldn't just walk there, so they needed the van. And throughout this time too, they were finding weird things to do with a pig. They'd find like hoof tracks outside, and then they'd follow the tracks and it would lead to the garage, and the garage door was like ripped off, and even though they looked everywhere in the garage, they couldn't find any animal, and it really did look like a pig. And so eventually Kathy brought up Jody again, and that's when George and Kathy were like, Jody, this pig, what the hell? And they kind of determined that it was this evil force. You never really get an answer as to what this could have been. So on the last like day or two that the Lutzes were at the Amityville property, what really sent them over the edge is their kids were starting to have experiences. Like there was this one point where Chris went to use the washroom in the middle of the night, and at this point all the family members are sleeping in their master bedroom because that's how scared everyone is. And Chris gets up to use the washroom, and the washroom in the master bedroom is locked for some reason, so he goes up to the third floor to use that washroom, and when he opens the door he can look down and see all of his family members sleeping, so it's like there was no floor, no nothing in between them, so that freaked him out. He went back downstairs, hopped back into bed, and everyone went to sleep. During this night, George had this nightmare where a pig was trampling him and he couldn't move, he couldn't breathe, and he was just like screaming but he couldn't move. That happened a few times to George throughout this whole experience, where he'd kind of have, what is that, sleep paralysis, kind of where you wake up, you can't move. The temperature during these last few days in the house was shifting a lot too. One minute it would be boiling and so extremely hot that, you know, they'd completely put out the fire, and then in the next instant it was so cold that they were like shivering. It was really just going back and forth. And then on the very last night they were there, it was said that they woke up in the middle of the night and like drawers were opening and closing. They could hear bed frames being like scraped on the floors above them. And on the last night too, the boys actually got attacked by this white hooded figure, the same one that was trying to come out of the fireplace at Kathy and George. This hooded figure tried to reach out and grab the boys when they were upstairs in their bedroom. George and Kathy grabbed all the kids, grabbed the dog, they put the key in the van, it worked, and they drove off to Kathy's mother's house to stay there because they were like, and we're done. So the Lutz family peeled out of the Amityville property driveway at 7 a.m. on January 14th, 1976, and they haven't been back to the property since. So during their time at the Amityville house, they did try a couple of different techniques to try to rid their house of this entity, of this thing, of whatever was plaguing them. George started reading up on demonology and witchcraft to try and get a better understanding of what he was dealing with and how he could best protect him and his family. George contacted a medium. He also contacted a paranormal researcher to help give proof of diabolical influence. And during this time, him and Kathy both tried to get their family priest to come back to the property to bless it, and he would repeatedly refuse to come. He just would not come back. And all of these people who tried to help the Lutz family, the medium, the priest, the paranormal researcher, they were all affected by the malevolent force inside the Amityville house. After the Lutz family fled the property, there was a seance that was held there by Ed and Lorraine Warren and a couple other spiritualists the following February, and they had some interesting findings, to say the least. And that's what we're going to be talking about in part 3 of this Amityville series. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't lose me in the social media void and so you don't miss out on the next video in this series. Find me on Instagram if you enjoy witchy content. Follow me on Facebook if you enjoy Halloween memes. And I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I'll see you in my next one.